Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. The Islamic paradigm. Islamic paradigm at its most reduced form is nassun wa hamlun alayh. Nas is a text, hamlun alayh is reference to that text. So revelation and reference to revelation. Obviously all Muslims say their knowledge starts with the Quran. So they all accept the Quran. What they differ obviously is how they interpret the Quran. So Quran is the source number one. Source number two is the hadith, or the accepted hadith. And in the traditional paradigm, the accepted hadith is a sahih initially, and then gradually that included al-hasan. And the traditional paradigm, the hadith is supposed to be the second source of knowledge, but in practicality, it is very much on equal ground as the Quran. There is a theory that sort of started with Imam Shafi'i. It's the theory of al-wahyin, nazariyat al-wahyin. Al-wahy is the revelation, or al-wahyin is the two revelations. And basically it goes something like the Quran is one revelation, but the Prophet ﷺ was given another revelation. And surely he was. But the assumption here is that the hadith between our hands is that second revelation. And that gap is bridged just by simple.
That's a bit of a big claim to say that, because from everything that I have read and what is common knowledge, is that it's exactly what you say, which is that everybody puts Quran first, and then they put the hadith second. Now you're saying that in practice, they put them on equal grounds.
Yes, yes. And I even dare to say occasionally they put the Sunnah first and not the Quran, because they say the Quran is missing details and in need of the Sunnah to finish those details. Some have been, not all, some have been so excessive to say that the Quran needs the Sunnah more than the Sunnah needs the Quran. So in practicality, even though they say the Quran is qat' al-subut, we are sure that it was narrated as is from the Prophet ﷺ, and the Sunnah is dhanni subut, probabilistic, even though they say that in theory, but in practice it is very much on equal ground as the Quran.
Okay, and this time when you're talking about Sunnah, you're talking about all of Sunnah, or you're talking about specifically about hadith?
No, I'm talking about specifically about hadith. In the traditional paradigm, there is no difference between hadith and Sunnah. Historically there is, but in the traditional paradigm is the final product of about 300 or 400 years. And then after that it was sort of solidified, and there was only very minor changes to it. It was very much in flux in the beginning of those centuries. After 300 or 400 years, it pretty much solidified, and that final product is what we have right now.
Mm-hmm.
So when by that time, like around 300 or 400 years, the distinction between Sunnah and Hadith became extremely blurred, and Sunnah was equal to Hadith, and Hadith was equal to Sunnah. The way people dealt with Hadith epistemologically, the result of how they dealt with Hadith epistemologically made them elevate the Sunnah to the same degree as the Quran. For example, when Imam al-Shafi'i, you have to understand every school has usul. Usul it's basically elements of its theory of knowledge. And when Imam al-Shafi'i laid out a very, very distinguished asl, and that is the hadith is a separate source, independent source of knowledge, and not contingent to the Quran. With that claim, he had to create the theory of al-wahyin. That means this is a wahy, this wahy, on equal ground, because the way they dealt with the hadith, for example, hadith making nasakh to Quran, is irrational unless you make them on equal ground.
Can you explain nasakh?
Nasakh is when you take a hadith, and because of the hadith gives you contradicts a verse in the Quran, and of course they don't acknowledge in the traditional paradigm. They don't acknowledge contradiction because it's an idealistic thinking. So they revert to the concept of nasikh, which means you keep the verse in the Quran, but you do not enforce it, or that whatever you understand from that verse in the Quran is null and void. So because of that relationship between hadith and Quran, hadith became at least on equal ground, sometimes even more. So in theory, hadith is number two. In practice, it's very much on equal ground. And after hadith comes the ijma. Ijma is consensus. And I'm not going to dwell too much on ijma because it's a problematic category. People use it, but for all practical reasons, it's a theoretical category. There's not a whole lot of stuff that you take from ijma in terms of the details of sharia. Because the things that are unequivocal ijma, things are unequivocal consensus, they are so agreed upon that you don't need to create a category for it. For example, not the details, like the ruk'ahs of the salah, or the fact that there is 5 salah, or very, very major issues like that. And once you get down to the details, the ijma is a claim, but it doesn't pan out in real life. So, one particular school may say, we have ijma, this issue is, there's ijma on it, but in reality there's always 1 or 2 or 3 people that don't agree with this ijma. And the way ijma is defined, it's problematic to actually prove that it did happen, except when Islam was very much contained. Let's say around the early time of the Sahaba. After that, it's so widespread that to fulfill the definition of ijma is extremely problematic. So ijma is a theoretical category for all practical reasons. Not to say that what is the definition of Muslims. You have to include that in ijma, because is it ijma Ahl Sunnah only, or is it ijma Ahl Sunnah and Ahl Bid'ah, or the deviant sects? Of course, they don't call themselves deviant, but Ahl Sunnah would call them deviant. And to add more complexity to that, like right now, 1 millennia and a half later, like you would look at some of those sects and say, yes, they are clearly deviant, clearly on the wrong path. But as you go back in time, that distinction is less and less. The early Shia texts, the very early Shia sects, they were not a whole lot different from Sunnah. And the same thing goes for other sects that like the Mu'tazila, that we basically just judge them by the record of their nemesis, so to speak. So it's hard, really. The bottom line is, it's really hard to have an unequivocal ijma that fulfills all the criteria. So for all practical reasons, it's a theoretical category. So category number 4 is al-qiyas. Beginning with category number 4, you enter the realm of ijtihad in general.
But just define qiyas.
Qiyas is analogy. You get a substance today that causes the brain to twist, and you do an analogy to sukkar, or getting intoxicated because of alcohol, and alcohol is haram, then this new substance should be haram. That's qiyas in its simplest form. The first 2 schools, the Hanafi and the Maliki, they, at least for the Hanafi, they consider qiyas, some qiyas at least, that are based on a very strong text, or very obvious. When the reason of the qiyas is very obvious, or al is very obvious, they would consider that to supersede al-hadith. Hadith al-ahad, which is the majority of hadith. So the order of the epistemologic order of the sources was not as clearly defined as we know it right now. Later on, when the hadith became dominant epistemologically, because those schools are well accepted within the Sunni tradition, people sort of had to go out of their ways to prove that no, really, those early scholars of those schools, didn't really sort of mean what they meant, and it was an issue of the fact that they didn't really get the hadith, rather than the fact that they didn't consider the hadith, in that order that they considered. Like, qiyas can be more stronger than hadith. In early Hanafi, qiyas can be more stronger than hadith. So the later schools became later in those schools. Because those schools were accepted, they couldn't like just delete them or take them out. They had to sort of justify that behavior, epistemologic choices, in a way that does not compromise the position of the hadith. After qiyas, so Ahnaf is, they're heavy on qiyas. Why they're heavy on qiyas? It's like, it's like almost almost, when you have one category of sources of knowledge is bigger, another category shrinks. For them, the category of hadith is shrink. So ijtihad has to go up, beginning with qiyas. While you see, also for Maliki, the category of hadith, relatively speaking, of course, compared to Shafi'iyya and compared to Hanabila, is less. So something else in ijtihad had to go up. And they're famous for maslaha, which is, when you consider ijtihad, you either try to seek knowledge in the guidance of the text based on the commonality between the current circumstance and something that is well described in the text, Quran or Sunnah, and that is al-qiyas, or you go directly to what you think is where the true benefit of the Muslim society lies, and you just say, because this is a benefit, I'm just going to go directly to the target. So one is logically stemming from the source of knowledge, which is the text, and the other is hitting the target directly. And that is maslaha. As long as that maslaha is not discredited in the sharia. Like as long as there's not like a verse in the Quran that says, no, this is not a maslaha. For example, gambling. So that is called maslaha. Sometimes they call it a loose qiyas, al-qiyas al-mursal, or a loose qiyas, because the illah or the reason is loosely falls within some general category of what Islam is trying to bring to the Muslim population, which is a maslaha at the end of the day.
It's benefit.
Yes, benefit. So in Maliki, when the benefit is large, the hadith is small, benefit is larger. In Shafi'i, he considered, he made a huge step in support of the hadith, so he considered an independent epistemologic source. So with the Shafi'i, and even more so with the Hanbali, the hadith is very big, so the ijtihad in general is small. In fact, the Shafi'i did not consider any other form of ijtihad besides, for the most part, besides al-qiyas. But the amount of qiyas he did is less.
And he was able to do that because he had a huge amount
exactly.
of hadith to pull qiyas from.
Exactly. And he was not in as much in need of ijtihad as the other two schools, again in the early phases, because he had so much hadith to fall back on. And as you see, as the hadith grew, the criteria to what is acceptable became a little more and more loose, because people needed something to rely on to make the jurisprudence. And when they find hadith, then they don't basically look for ijtihad, because ijtihad is, at the end of the day, is someone putting some mental effort into it and trying to figure out what is the right action to do, or the right conclusion to take. So to them, the action of the human mind was considered less valuable than a hadith. So it was inferior. So as the
which does make sense, right? Assuming that the hadith itself is authentic. The Prophet really did say that, right?
And that's and the whole story is in that assumption.
Right.
The whole story is in that assumption. So it's an epistemologic choice. After qiyas and maslaha, you get sort of minor categories of ijtihad. So the majority of ijtihad falls within qiyas and maslaha. The categories of how to order ijtihad, so everybody agrees Quran is number one. Everybody agrees hadith is number two, theoretically. But as I said, practically it's really also a second number one. Ijma' is theoretical, so we're not going to consider it much. And then ijtihad. The order of ijtihad, like what is the authentic or what is the considered the acceptable order in today's paradigm in ijtihad, pretty much everybody considers qiyas to be number one after hadith. But then after that, it's sort of, they're so loose that there is not a big agreement on how to order those sources, or what are even those sources, because you could expand the sources within ijtihad. For example, some people consider part of ijtihad like what is narrated to be the decisions of the al-Khulafa al-Rashidin al-Arba'. For example, there's a category called Amal al-Sahabi, what the Sahabi did or what the Sahabi understood. There's a category called al-Urf, or what's commonly known, commonly knowledge. It's a considered minor category, while it should, in the new paradigm, it should take a bigger place than it did. But generally speaking, qiyas is number one as far as the categories of ijtihad. Now that is the established paradigm. So the established paradigm is heavily relies heavily on the hadith, and because this paradigm sort of solidified in the 2nd, 3rd century, there was an abundance of hadith at that time. So the paradigm solidified within that environment.
Okay, so just a small question then. Like, as you mentioned, the Ahnaf don't really follow that. You know, they're
the early.
The early, and same thing with the Malik. So you're saying the early, so because that is my question then. What has happened to those two schools since then?
Perfect. So that is a good point to go into the chronology of how this whole thing came to be, and for that we'll start a new video.
Okay.